he came back and played a lot better than I think a lot of people thought he was going to. Alright everybody, welcome back to another episode of NBA Now. It's your boy Dom, and we're going to get right into things here today. So, today, we are talking about the Houston Rockets, and more specifically, we're talking about John Wall. Now the Houston Rockets, let's be honest, are not a very good basketball team. They are tied for the worst record in the entirety of the NBA with the Detroit Pistons at 4-16 apiece, although technically Orlando is worse at 4-18 because the Pistons and Houston have a chance to lose 2 more games, if that makes sense. But either way, they suck. They're not very good. And there's promise on this roster, but the big thing with the John Wall situation, we'll kind of get into that here as we go. But when you look at what John Wall did last year, I think he exceeded a lot of expectations that a lot of people had for him. You know, we hadn't really seen him play a full season since 2016, 2017, and we hadn't seen real John Wall since then. And this is a guy that, you know, coming into the season was traded for Russell Westbrook and was looked at as one of the worst contracts in the NBA, and came out and he averaged over 20 points per game, and he had a pretty decent season. Now, I think when watching it, you could tell he's not the John Wall of old and everything like that, but considering everything that had happened with his injuries and, you know, a lot of thoughts on how he would come back and everything like that, he came back and played a lot better than I think a lot of people thought he was going to, which was definitely a pleasant surprise for Houston. Although it didn't end up winning him a lot of games, it was something that they were at least able to look at and be like, oh, he played all right. Now, he only played 40 games last year, but obviously, like I said, in those 40 games, he looked pretty solid. And coming into this season, you know, it was looked at as, okay, he could potentially start or maybe come off the bench for the veterans. Then, prior to the season kind of coming into full swing, we found out that he was going to kind of sit out for the Rockets this year until they could find a trade partner for him, which they were looking to do. And with them never really finding that trade partner, and with his contract being so big and that difficult, a couple days ago, some reports came out from Woj where it was like the Rockets are discussing John Wall's return to play, and that kind of got a lot of people excited. We were like, okay, we can see John Wall again. This is something the team really needs, is more playmakers, and this could be big to help develop some of these younger guys, right? We all, I think, as a collective for NBA fans, looked at this as a positive, and then it ended up not being. And actually, I think it ended up being a big negative, because I think the injection of John Wall's veteran presence and him knowing how to make the playoffs and him still being a pretty good basketball player, not what he was by any means, but there's not a crazy amount of, I don't know what the number is, but there's not a crazy amount of guys that can just come out and average 20 even on a bad team. It still takes you constantly, night in and night out, being able to just be one of the better players on the court, you know what I mean? And, you know, a lot of people looked at, if John Wall could be a bench player or whatever for the Rockets, that would be really big for them. It could help that second unit actually get stuff going and everything like that. And then it came out that he wouldn't be playing for them, and he wouldn't be playing for them for the same reason that he didn't play for them at the start of the season, and that was that they had no willingness to let him even compete for the starting job. And now I understand wanting to have Kevin Porter Jr. be your point guard and whatever, and see how that kind of works next to Jalen Green and all that. But at the end of the day, it looks like you're tanking, and it's pretty obvious to the league, to the fans, And all that's going to do is make it harder to get back once you want to be winning, right? Now you have a guy like Eric Gordon who plays off the bench or whatever, and even Christian Wood isn't the youngest guy, but he's bounced around a lot, and really last year was his first opportunity to kind of get things going, and he made the most of it. You know, before he got injured, he was kind of considered to be a potential all-star, and really kind of had things going for him there. Now obviously he did sustain an injury last year, and that kind of derailed things for him, but even this season he's looked super solid, especially when he's kind of that solo big that they are playing. It's at least recently helped them win a little bit more. But just the Rockets, they aren't a good team, and you can expect them to be great, but having John Wall out there would do a lot for you, because it's just another veteran guy to kind of teach a lot of these young guys just a way to win night in and night out. It's something that isn't always looked at in the NBA. It's, it's kind of, oh, let's go get the talent and everything like that. But if you aren't able to win against bad teams, which the Rockets are a bad team right now, so they should be losing. But if you aren't, once you get to that point where you have the talent and everything like that, if you aren't able to win against those bad teams and then compete against the good teams, you're not going to be good. And that's something that like the Timberwolves struggle with, right? The Timberwolves, who this year are starting to maybe make something of themselves as the 6th seed. For years now, we've looked at them as just a joke. They haven't been able to get things together, even though they've had talent. And the only year that they did anything was with Jimmy Butler. And Jimmy Butler kind of came in and was excited to play with them. When they didn't have him on the court, they were like a different team. And then by the next season, he was so fed up with just the culture in Minnesota that he took the third strings, whooped up on the starters, and said, get me out of here, right? And he just thought that they were soft, and none of them had that winning component, and maybe that's because they didn't have that earlier in their careers, right? Cat hadn't won until he got Jimmy. And yeah, they had Kevin Garnett or whatever, but that was way, way, way past Kevin Garnett's prime. That was at the tail end of his career, and that was more like a farewell tour type thing for Kevin Garnett. But like they never won or anything like that, and bringing in Jimmy, it kind of showed him a little taste of it, and they've been trying to chase that ever since, while still not quite having it all together, because, well, they only had him for a year, and really they were an entirely different team without him on the court. But the Rockets, you don't want to end up in a situation like that. You want to end up in a situation somewhat to the Warriors, right? Where, now you didn't get the opportunity to keep one of the better players in your franchise history, like the Warriors got to keep in Steph Curry when they kind of went through a small retooling phase, more, say, for the Warriors than a rebuild, because he wanted out, and that's why you have to rebuild, right? You didn't have a lot of ceiling with your roster. You were kind of stuck where you were, and he saw better opportunities around the league to go and compete for a championship and whatnot, and kind of forced his way out. Now you got a return that I think a lot of people are looking at as not the return that maybe you could have gotten, right? I think just getting the picks is kind of looked at as a failure on the Rockets' part, and although James Harden hasn't been what he was for the Rockets in Brooklyn, I almost said New York, in Brooklyn, he still, I think they got, not lowballed, because they got a crap ton of picks from the Nets, but they didn't probably take the best offer that was available, and I understand not wanting to, kind of wanting to develop your own guys and that kind of homegrown talent, right? Where you draft them and they become big. It's something the Nuggets have been very good at as a Nuggets fan. But sometimes bringing in guys and molding them into your roster and building around them can be something big for your team. It's something that teams have done in the past and have been successful at. Even when you look at like the Phoenix Suns, right? Now, this is completely different because Chris Paul was a lot older, but he was a guy that, they brought in and he kind of showed them how to win. And going back to John Wall, kind of the premise of this video, him not even be able to play because you won't even give him the opportunity to start is kind of a joke. Because there's no, I think from what we've seen from Kevin Porter Jr. in these past 20 games or whatever, there's no realm of possibility that you can tell me that John Wall couldn't potentially, even just potentially, and I'm not saying you would, but even just potentially be better than what Kevin Porter Jr. is kind of a joke. And I understand wanting to develop him, but even if you look at it, Kevin Porter Jr. was super good off the bench for you last year. So what's to say that that's not his role for your team in the future? If John Wall were to end up beating him out for the starting job if you gave him the opportunity, I think, and you don't think that he's a good enough player to lead you to a lot of wins, well, maybe that shows you that Kevin Porter Jr. isn't a good enough point guard to lead you to a ton of wins. Now, could he be a six-man? Could he start at the 2 and Jalen Green at the 3? Absolutely. But maybe he isn't your option at the 1. And that's something that Houston wasn't even willing to entertain. It's like they have a mindset of how their roster is going to be, and they're not going to take anybody else's word on it, which is something that can be very dangerous. It's something I think the Sacramento Kings have done a lot, where they kind of get their team, they get a little bit of talent or whatever, and they're like, okay, it's going to work like this, and that's just how it's going to work. And then if it doesn't work, like Luke Walton, he probably should have never been hired in the first place, but everybody knew that first week that he was coaching the Kings, that first month, that first season, that it wasn't going to work with him as the coach. And then come around 2 years later, he ends up getting fired. And not a lot of people were shocked, because most people thought it should have happened before he was hired. He should have just not been hired. And I think that that's something that, now the Rockets, I think, have a good coach. I think Silas kind of got put in a situation similar to John Wall, where, he thought he was going to have James Harden, where John Wall thought he was going to have him as like his running mate. Steven Silas thought he was going to be coaching James Harden. And then that season, Harden pushes his way out, right? I think you can't blame Silas for that, and you have to give him the opportunity to rebuild with this team and kind of mold himself into the team, mold his system into it and everything like that, because he was a part of making that Dallas Mavericks offense that was historical with Luka, and he saw James Harden, a very similar player, thought he was going to be able to head coach for that and everything like that, wasn't able to. And so I think him and John Wall are in a similar situation. But Silas is getting the opportunity to coach these guys and kind of make this team his own and everything like that, whereas John Wall kind of is getting thrown to the curb. And, for John Wall, part of it you kind of have to understand, you might not get that starting role, but I agree you should have the opportunity to compete for it, because at the end of the day, that's another playmaker that the Rockets need on the floor to help get some of these younger guys open shots and help night in, night out, maybe playing and winning, maybe night in and night out be a little easier. Because like the Warriors, a lot of their games, they are not close. They are blowouts for a lot of their games. When you look at their last few games, now they are about to play the Phoenix Suns tonight, but when you look at the Clippers game or the Blazers game or the Philly game or the Toronto game, those are all 15 to 20 point victories over the other team. And those are some pretty decent teams as well. It's not like it's a terrible team, but against maybe not as great of a team as we talked about earlier in the Detroit Pistons, it did become a little bit of a closer game. But because they aren't playing, a 3-point game every single night, they're able to pull out a lot more of those than a team like the Rockets are able to. And they end up winning by 3 against Detroit, right? Whereas the Rockets, when you look at their schedule, they lose by a lot. And so if you can't even be in close games, it's going to be harder for you to win those. And though, although they are on a 3-game win streak, and, they beat OKC pretty handedly, although OKC is kind of in a similar situation to the Rockets. When you look at the game versus Charlotte, they had to go to overtime and put up 146 points to win by 3. And although Charlotte's a pretty decent team, that's something you can't sustain, is putting up 150 points in overtime and only winning by 3. Because it's going to tire your players out. It would lead to injuries. It just isn't possible to constantly do that. Now, if you're going to have a lot of closer games where, like, you're 2 or 3 points away, then you can find a way to win some of those. But you have to be able to also just have some games where you just blow teams out by 20, and so for those closer games, it's a little bit easier for you. And I think that that's something that, they'll get better at as this team gets older and stuff like that. But having a guy like John Wall might get you in more of those closer games, so you're more used to that feeling of, okay, it's time to battle it out. We're in the final stretch here, and we just have to play better than they do on both sides of the floor, right? And John Wall's a decent defender. He's a good playmaker. He is not going to just be getting shots for himself, like some other borderline or older stars or not stars anymore, whatever word you want to describe him as, and categorize him in. He's not going to be the same as some of those guys that are kind of in his same category, because he's not just a scorer, right? He's a guy that makes a lot for others, and he's going to hustle on the defensive end. And yes, he's going to want to get his shots up and everything like that. He is John Wall, after all, right? A guy that is one of the most played players in the NBA. When he was at his peak, was in MVP votings, was very good for the Washington Wizards. So obviously there's still going to be some of that to him, but maybe having some of that to him would help this team. And this team, I think, is so wrapped around getting that first overall or second overall pick that it's hurting them in that sense, because you don't have to get that first overall or second overall pick or whatever it is. Now, this is a draft that you really want that, because Chet Holmgren and Banchero are very, very good players and look like they're going to succeed in the NBA. But you don't have to be the worst two teams in the NBA to get that. You can be, as we've seen, the 5th or the 6th team, and because of the adjusted lottery odds a few years ago, it's easier for you to get the top pick now, without tanking all the way. Now, if you're not a good team and you deserve a good player, you're going to get a good player. If you get a player, even if you got the 5th pick, which maybe isn't what you want, you can still go get a guy like Tyrese Halliburton, or get a guy like, I don't know why my brain is slipping on his name, but he plays with Tyrese Halliburton, and the Kings just drafted him. But you could go get a guy like Tyrese Halliburton, or you could go get a guy like Davion Mitchell, guys that fell later in the draft than 5, where a lot of people thought that they should have gotten drafted a little bit higher, and the Kings ended up picking up both of them and got some new talent onto their roster pretty easily by waiting and drafting the best player available. And that wasn't even at the 5th overall position. If you're at the 5th overall position, you get a guy like that, you can consider that draft a win, right? You got a good player out of it, and you do that for a couple drafts. Now you've got a lot of talent on your roster, and you can really get your team rolling at that point. So you just got a 2nd overall pick in Jalen Green. So although maybe he's not your number 1, or maybe you want a B to him, or you want him to be a B to somebody's A, right? There's still that opportunity to jump up in it, because even if you have the 3rd worst record in the NBA, you have the exact same chance as the person with the 1st worst record in the entire NBA. And I think that's something that the Rockets haven't completely wrapped their head around. I think that their front office is being a little bit stubborn, and I think from even a player's perspective, I assume that they would want John Wall out there, because, like I said, he's going to help get them some open shots. He's going to be a veteran that they can learn from. Who knows? Maybe another year of Kevin Porter Jr. watching John Wall teaches him a lot to try and run that point guard position, as it seems that he struggled a bit more than even I thought he was going to this season, right? And it's not something where you have to play John Wall 40 minutes a game or whatever. If you're playing John Wall 25 minutes a game, or maybe he goes out, maybe he wins the starting job, but you only want him out there for like 24 minutes a game because you want Kevin Porter Jr. to get more run off the bench, or whatever it is. You do that. You're not like locked into this guy long term. You've got him for a couple more seasons, then his contract's going to be off the board, then you can move in a different direction, spend that money elsewhere. But while you have him, there's no point in leaving a 20-point per game scorer just out of your lineup entirely when he's healthy. You might as well get what you can out of him, since you're probably not going to be able to trade him. I think that this contract just is beyond untradeable, and I think part of that, when you look at John Wall, is he's kind of got to accept maybe he's not going to get everything he wants because of the volume of his contract, but I still think it's unfair to not give him any opportunity, and I think it's a short-sighted view by the Rockets, who are trying to look so far down the line and believe so much in players' potential, that sometimes you just have to let players learn, and I think that's something that they're not really looking at. But regardless, let me know what you guys think on the John Wall situation. I think it's kind of a big mistake for the Rockets. I do think it's kind of similar to the Kemba Walker situation, although in a very different way, which is totally contradictory of what I just said. But if you guys do want a video on that, make sure you guys let me know. And regardless, it's been your boy Dom. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll catch y'all next time. Peace out, guys.